we need to talk about what just happened in the Madura Strait, because what started as a standard industrial operation off the coast of Indonesia has just violently collided with the established timeline of human history. For decades, the accepted model has been clean and linear. We are told that if you want to find the ancestors of humanity, you look in the caves of Africa or the buried layers of the Rift Valley. You do not look underwater. But that model just broke. In 2011, a dredging ship was operating near Surabaya between the islands of Java and Madura. The mission was mundane. They were dredging sand for land reclamation projects. It's a massive, loud industrial process. Giant pumps suck up millions of tons of silt and debris from the seafloor, churning up the sea to build new real estate. It is the definition of destruction. You don't find history in a dredging pipe. You find mud. But then, the pumps started choking on something that wasn't mud. Among the endless slurry of gray silt, workers started noticing shapes, hard, calcified shapes. Not rocks or coral, but bones. At first, it looked like a fluke, maybe a whale carcass, maybe a few scattered remains of modern marine life. But the bones kept coming, and they were getting bigger. The dredging operation had accidentally punched a hole through the seafloor and into a time capsule that had been sealed for 140,000 years. They pulled up over 6,000 fossilized bones. And when the experts finally got their hands on them, they didn't just see a few dead fish. They saw a zoo of nightmares. They found the remains of Komodo dragons, but not the ones you see in zoos today. These were found alongside the bones of stegodons, prehistoric, elephant-like titans that stood over 13 feet tall. Massive herbivores that haven't walked the earth in eons. But that wasn't the anomaly. We know megafauna existed. Finding a mammoth bone is rare, but it's not impossible. The anomaly was what they found next. Buried in that same layer of silt, encased in the same hard marine deposits as the stegodons and the dragons, were two specific fragments. One frontal, one parietal. Skull fragments. They weren't from a monkey. They weren't from an ape. They were human. Or, to be more specific, they were Homo erectus. This is where the crisis begins. The official narrative says that fossilization is a delicate process. It requires specific conditions on land rabbit burial, lack of oxygen, stable soil. The ocean is destructive. Salt water dissolves. Currents scatter. Marine worms and bacteria devour everything. Finding a pristine hominin fossil on land is like winning the lottery. Finding one at the bottom of the ocean after 140,000 years is statistically impossible. And yet, there it was. A team led by Dutch archaeologist Harold Berghuis analyzed the fragments. They didn't just look at the shape. They looked at the dirt. They used optically stimulated luminescence OSL dating to determine exactly when those bones were last exposed to sunlight. The results came back, and they were terrifyingly precise, 162,000 to 119,000 years ago. This effectively confirms that the patch of ocean between Java and Madura isn't just water. It is a drowned continent. It is the physical proof of Sunderland. Now, you might have heard of Sunderland before. It's usually discussed in theoretical terms. Geologists look at the depth of the Sunda shelf and say, yes, during the Pleistocene, sea levels were lower, so this was probably land. But there is a massive difference between a geological theory and a crime scene. What Berghuis and his team found is a crime scene. They didn't just find bones. They found the river. By analyzing the sediment layers, they reconstructed the path of a massive ancient river system that once flowed eastward across the plain. A continuation of the ancient Solo River. This wasn't a swamp. It wasn't a dense, impenetrable jungle. The fossil record of the deer and the antelope-like species found in the dredge proves that this was a savanna, a vast, open grassland teeming with game, predators, and fresh water. It was a paradise, and it was inhabited. Microscopic analysis of the animal bones found at the site revealed something that shouldn't be there. Precise cut marks. Nature doesn't make straight lines. Sharks don't leave surgical incisions. These marks were made by tools. Someone was down there. Someone was hunting the stegodons. Someone was butchering the deer. Someone was living, thriving, and dominating this landscape for thousands of years. And then, the water took them. The mainstream timeline tells us that the sea level rise at the end of the last ice age was a gradual process, a slow, creeping tide that took thousands of years to swallow the coastlines. We are told that humans just moved inland, that it was a gentle migration. But you don't leave 6,000 bones in a single pile during a gentle migration. You don't leave your ancestors' skulls in the mud if you have time to pack up and leave. The density of the find near Surabaya implies something else. It implies that this world wasn't just abandoned, it was erased. The glaciers melted between 14,000 and 7,000 years ago, raising the ocean by 120 meters. That is a wall of water 400 feet high. It didn't just flood the beaches, it drowned the continent. We are looking at a snapshot of a lost world that was frozen in time by the ocean. And here is the problem. If Homo erectus was thriving on the savannas of Sundaland 140,000 years ago, hunting 13-foot elephants and navigating vast river systems that are now deep underwater, what else is down there? We have explored less than 5% of our oceans. We assume the history of humanity is written in the dirt we walk on. But this discovery proves that the vast majority of our history, the missing chapters, the lost migrations, the civilizations that rose and fell before we even invented the word civilization, is not buried in the ground, it is drowning. The discovery in the Madura Strait is not just a fossil find, it is a warning shot. It tells us that the map we use is incomplete. It tells us that beneath the waves of Southeast Asia, there are ghost rivers, ghost plains, and ghost populations that have been waiting for us to find them. When we say fossil, you probably picture a museum curator dusting off a bone with a toothbrush. That is not what happened here. This was industrial salvage. This was a violent extraction. The site is located in the Madura Strait, specifically in the separation zone between Java and Madura. Today, this is a busy shipping lane. It is water, but the data tells us that 140,000 years ago, this specific coordinate was the epicenter of a biological superhighway. Let's look at the forensic evidence. The team recovered a parietal bone and a frontal bone. In plain English, that is the top and the front of a human skull. But these aren't Homo sapiens. These belong to Homo erectus. This is a critical distinction. Homo erectus was the first human species to walk fully upright, the first to leave Africa, and the first to master fire. They were the pioneers, and for decades, the mainstream consensus was that they were primitive, struggling to survive in the jungles of Java. But the skull fragments found in the strait tell a different story. They were found in a layer of sediment that dates to the late Middle Pleistocene. A silver moon illuminated the calm lake surface, creating ripples overnight and 1919,000 years ago. Now, look at the ecosystem they were ruling. The dredge didn't just pull up a few isolated bones. It pulled up a graveyard of titans. They found stegodons. If you don't know what a stegodon is, imagine an elephant, but lower to the ground, bulkier, with tusks that grew so long they often crossed over each other. Some of these beasts stood over 13 feet tall at the shoulder. They were walking tanks, and they were being hunted. The sheer volume of stegodon remains found in that specific layer suggests that this wasn't just a random death, it was a kill zone. And they weren't alone. The site contained the remains of Bubalus paleocarabaua, prehistoric water buffalo with horns that spanned nearly 10 feet. It contained the remains of giant tortoises. It contained the ancestors of the modern tiger. And, perhaps most chillingly, it contained the remains of the Komodo dragon. Today, Komodo dragons are isolated on a few tiny islands. They are leftovers. But back then, they were the dominant scavenger of the grassy plains. They were everywhere. So, put the picture together. You have a landscape that looks like the African Serengeti, but it's in Southeast Asia. You have 13-foot elephants. You have 10-foot buffalo. You have giant lizards. And in the middle of all of this, you have Homo erectus, dominating. The microscopic analysis of the bones confirmed clean cut marks. This is the smoking gun. A stegodon has thick skin. To butcher one, you need sharp tools, and you need organized cooperation. You don't take down a 13-foot mega herbivore by yourself. This proves that the humans living on this sunken continent had a society. They had strategy. They had a culture of hunting that allowed them to thrive in a world filled with monsters. But the most disturbing part of this discovery isn't the biology. It's the geology. The researchers used the sediment data to map out the terrain. They found the ghost of a river. They discovered that the fossils were deposited in what used to be a massive river system, a lost extension of the Solo River. Today, the Solo River empties into the sea on the coast of Java, but 140,000 years ago, that river didn't stop. It kept flowing, winding its way across the dry plains of the Sunken Shelf, creating a lush green corridor that stretched for hundreds of miles. It was a prehistoric highway. Animals followed the water. Humans followed the animals. This river was the lifeblood of a civilization that has been completely erased from our history books. And this brings us to the impossible fact that the authorities are struggling to reconcile. We are taught that the ocean is a barrier. We are taught that early humans were trapped on islands, isolated by the waves. But the Madura Strait discovery proves that the ocean wasn't a barrier. It was a bridge. This entire region, Sundaland, was a continent twice the size of India. It connected Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Sumatra, Java, and Borneo into one massive, continuous landmass. It wasn't a series of islands. It was a solid, unified world. And it was inhabited by a species that was arguably just as successful as we are. Homo erectus lived there for over 1 million years. They survived volcanic eruptions. They survived climate shifts. They built a life on the banks of that ancient river. And then the water came. The silver the story shifts from archaeology to existential threat. The global timeline shows us that around 14,000 years ago, the ice caps melted, the Great Thaw. It wasn't a slow drip. In geological terms, it was a flash flood. The sea levels rose by 120 meters. To visualize that, look at a 40-story skyscraper. That is how much water was dumped into the oceans. The vast plains of Sundaland didn't just get wet, they were obliterated. The river system where these Homo erectus hunters lived was drowned under massive pressure. The grasslands were turned into the seafloor. The hilltops became the islands we see today: Java, Borneo, Sumatra. The survivors were forced to retreat to higher ground. They were squeezed into smaller and smaller territories. The megafauna of the stegodons, the giant buffalo, couldn't adapt. Their habitat vanished. They went extinct. And the humans, they were cut off. Populations that used to walk from Java to Borneo were suddenly separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean. The discovery in the Madura Strait is physical proof of a great filter event. It shows us that a thriving dominant biosphere can be completely reset by a change in sea level. We look at the ocean today and we see a flat blue surface. We think of it as empty space, but the data from Surabaya screams that we are wrong. The ocean isn't empty space. It is a storage locker for lost history. If a dredging ship in a random spot in Indonesia can pull up the remains of a lost species and a lost world, it implies that the seafloor is paved with them. We assume we know the history of human evolution. We have a nice, neat tree that leads from apes to us. But that tree is based only on the fossils we found on dry land. What if the main trunk of the tree isn't on land? What if the majority of human history, the cities, the settlements, the hunting grounds, the battlefields, is currently sitting under 300 feet of salt water? The Madura Strait find suggests that our current understanding of history is suffering from survivorship bias. We only study the survivors who lived on the mountains that didn't flood. We completely ignore the millions who lived in the valleys that drowned. And here's the connection to the modern threat. The Homo erectus of Sundaland didn't know the water was coming. They didn't have satellites. They didn't have climate models. They just woke up one day, and the river was higher. And then the next day, it was higher again, until there was nowhere left to go. We are looking at their bones. We are holding their skulls. We are analyzing the remnants of their last meal. But we are failing to learn their lesson. Because right now, the ice is moving again. The water is rising again. And we're building our cities on the exact same coastlines that they used to hunt on. The dredging of the Madura Strait didn't just find a fossil. It found a mirror. And if you look closely at that mirror, you can see exactly what happens when the ocean decides to take back the land. This discovery forces us to ask the one question archaeology is terrified to answer. If we found a lost world of Homo erectus, 13-foot elephants, and a thriving river civilization just by accidentally dragging a pipe across the sea floor, what else have we missed? We operate under the arrogant assumption that we have mapped the human story. But the Surabaya discovery proves that our timeline is built on a massive survivor bias. We only study the history that stayed dry. For decades, we have looked at Homo erectus bones in caves and assumed they were primitive wanderers. But the evidence from the Madura Strait suggests that the cavemen were actually just the refugees. The populations we find in the mountains were the ones pushed to the fringes, the real civilization. The dense populations, the organized hunters who could butcher a stegodon, the societies that thrived on the banks of the ancient Solo River was down there. They were living in the garden, and the garden drowned. Think about where you live right now. New York, Tokyo, London, Shanghai. They are all on the coast. If the ocean rose 120 meters tomorrow, just like it did at the end of the Pleistocene, every single one of those cities would vanish. They would be ground into dust by the waves and erased from the map. In 100,000 years, a future archaeologist might find a few plastic bottles in the mountains and assume that was the peak of our civilization. They would never know about the skyscrapers, because the skyscrapers would be at the bottom of the Atlantic. That is exactly what happened to Homo erectus. The discovery in Indonesia is a terrifying reminder of our own fragility. We look at the climate data today. We see the ice sheets wobbling. We see the sea levels creeping up. To us, it feels slow, but to the Homo erectus of Sunderland, it probably felt slow too, until it wasn't. They didn't have a warning. They didn't have an evacuation plan. They just had a world that was getting smaller every single day. The dredging of the Madura Strait didn't just uncover a fossil. It uncovered a mirror. It tells us that the Earth is not a static stage for human history. It is a violent machine. It creates continents, and it destroys them. We are currently living in a temporary window where the oceans are stable. But history tells us that this window is closing. The Homo erectus skull found in that silt is a message from the deep. It is a testament to a species that was strong, capable, and dominant. And yet, in the end, the water won. So ask yourself, are we looking at the past? Or are we looking at our own future? We are covering the archaeological breakthroughs that the mainstream media ignores. If you want to know what else is hiding in the dark zones of our planet, click subscribe. The ocean is deep, and we have only just started to scratch the surface. Don't let the truth drown. I'll see you in the next one.